Hello, literary lovers! Welcome back to GMB, where we dive into the timeless tales that have shaped our world. Today, we're continuing our delightful journey through Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice. Be sure to check out Volume 1 to get the full story. In this video, we'll cover Volume 2, which includes chapters 24 through 42. So, grab your cup of tea and let's step back into the charming world of Hertfordshire. Our story picks up with Jane receiving another letter from Caroline Bingley, who writes that the Bingleys have no plans of returning to Netherfield. This news leaves Jane heartbroken and Elizabeth furious. Elizabeth blames Darcy and the Bingley sisters for interfering with Jane's happiness, and she resents Bingley for being so easily manipulated. Elizabeth's spirits are lifted somewhat by frequent visits from Mr. Wickham, who continues to be attentive and charming. Enter Mr. and Mrs. Gardiner, Mrs. Bennet's well-mannered and intelligent relatives. They arrive at Longbourn to spend Christmas with the Bennet family, and Elizabeth and Jane are especially close to them. Mrs. Gardiner, being the voice of reason, cautions Elizabeth against encouraging Wickham due to their mutual lack of fortune, making a match between them impractical. Observing Jane's melancholy, Mrs. Gardiner invites her to return to London with them, and Jane happily accepts, hoping to see Caroline Bingley. However, in London, Jane receives a chilly reception from Miss Bingley, confirming Elizabeth's suspicions of Caroline's insincerity. Meanwhile, Mr. Collins marries Charlotte Lucas, and they depart for Mr. Collins' parsonage in Hunsford. Before leaving, Charlotte invites Elizabeth to visit her soon, and Elizabeth reluctantly agrees. In March, Elizabeth, Charlotte's father, and her younger sister Maria visit Charlotte in Hunsford. On their way, they stay with the Gardiners in London, where Elizabeth and Mrs. Gardiner discuss Wickham's recent courtship of Miss King, an heiress. Mrs. Gardiner views his actions as mercenary, but Elizabeth defends his right to pursue a wealthy bride. Upon arriving at Hunsford, the group is invited to dine at Lady Catherine de Bourgh's residence, Rosings. Lady Catherine is domineering and intrusive, showing a tireless interest in the minutiae of life at the parsonage and in the village. Elizabeth's forthrightness shocks Lady Catherine, especially when she refuses to disclose her age. Excitement stirs with the arrival of Mr. Darcy and his cousin Colonel Fitzwilliam. Colonel Fitzwilliam impresses Elizabeth with his gentlemanlike manners, while Darcy remains as aloof as ever. At a dinner at Rosings, Darcy and Elizabeth engage in a spirited conversation about Darcy's reserved behavior among strangers. Elizabeth reproaches him for not trying harder to converse with people, while Darcy admits his difficulty in doing so. The next morning, Darcy visits the parsonage and finds Elizabeth alone. They discuss Bingley's plans and Charlotte's marriage to Mr. Collins, leading to a brief debate about what constitutes an easy distance for a woman to be separated from her family after marriage. Charlotte suspects Darcy might be in love with Elizabeth and closely observes his subsequent visits. Elizabeth keeps encountering Darcy during her walks, and he joins her despite her desire for solitude. One day, Colonel Fitzwilliam tells Elizabeth about Darcy saving Bingley from an imprudent marriage, which Elizabeth infers was to Jane. Angry and tearful, Elizabeth returns home and decides to avoid dinner at Rosings. That evening, Darcy visits Elizabeth and surprises her with a declaration of love and a marriage proposal. Initially flattered, Elizabeth becomes outraged as Darcy lists all the reasons he has resisted his feelings, including her inferior social class. Elizabeth refuses his proposal, condemning him for separating Jane and Bingley, treating Wickham poorly, and his arrogance. Darcy leaves, and the next morning he gives Elizabeth a letter addressing her accusations. He explains his involvement in Jane and Bingley's breakup, believing Jane did not love Bingley and trying to save him from an imprudent marriage. Darcy also reveals the truth about Wickham, who had tried to elope with Darcy's sister for her fortune. Initially disbelieving, Elizabeth soon realizes the truth of Darcy's words and feels ashamed of her prejudice against him. Darcy and Colonel Fitzwilliam leave Hunsford, and Elizabeth and Maria soon depart for Longbourn, stopping at the Gardiners in London. Jane returns home with them. Back at Longbourn, Kitty and Lydia are upset about the militia leaving for Brighton. Elizabeth is relieved that Wickham will be gone. Lydia is invited to accompany the militia colonel's wife to Brighton, and despite Elizabeth's concerns, Mr. Bennet allows her to go. Elizabeth eagerly awaits her trip with the Gardiners. They leave in July and decide to visit only Derbyshire, where Darcy's estate, Pemberley, is located. Mrs. Gardiner, who grew up in Derbyshire, insists on visiting Pemberley, and Elizabeth agrees after learning that Darcy will not be there. And that's where we'll leave Volume 2 of Pride and Prejudice. We've seen misunderstandings cleared, truths revealed, and relationships tested. What will happen when Elizabeth visits Pemberley? How will Darcy react to seeing her again? And what surprises await the Bennet family next? Stay tuned for Volume 3, where we'll unravel more of the drama, romance, and wit that make Pride and Prejudice such a beloved classic. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell so you won't miss our next installment. See you next time on GMB.